Alright, so listen, I know it's been a while since I've uploaded a video and my consistency hasn't been that great. But now that we're in a new year, I plan on dropping at least once a month. I would like to bump that number up, but I'm too preoccupied with other things to do so. But anyways, enough of that. Let's talk about some Bleach scaling. The topic I'll be touching on today is one that I've been wanting to talk about for a while now. I've probably had this idea in my catalog since like 2023. It's about the distance between the Seireitei and the Soul King Palace. Before I begin, let me give you some background on this video. I wanted to drop this video in like late January to early February, but now it's almost the end of March. I was expecting it to be around 10 minutes long, but as I was writing the script, I knew this was going to be another long one. You see, the first draft of this video script was me trying to debunk this enormous distance. Prior to the anime's adaptation of the 1000-year Blood War arc, I had serious objections to the calculations that placed this distance in the millions of kilometers. To me, this distance was just like 1,000 or so kilometers. But as I reviewed all the new info given to us by the anime, I began noticing faults in the arguments I wrote down. After some days of thinking everything through, my views changed and I concluded that yes, the distance really is that enormous. This was gonna be one of those very rare videos where, rather than refuting one of the widely accepted metas for Bleach, I was gonna reinforce it. But then, I stopped working on the script for a few days and thought about it some more. And after reviewing even more pieces of evidence, I changed my mind once again, circling back to my original position, which was that this distance is severely overestimated. And with that being said, let's go over the evidence so I can explain why I hold that position. If you want to find out how much distance was covered in a journey, you need two things: time and speed. Multiply them and you get the traversed distance. So to start off this analysis, let me ask you this. How long did it take Ichigo to travel from the Soul King Palace to the Seireitei? Before we begin though, let me debunk a common misconception. In chapter 555 of the Bleach manga, Tenjiro tells Ichigo that it'll take him a week to arrive at the Seireitei with Shunpo. This is not true, at least not for Ichigo. You see, the reason Tenjiro said that was because he wanted to agitate Ichigo the same way he did in the past, such as in chapter 519 when he was recovering in the hot springs. Basically, he made an outlandish claim to try and get a panicked response out of Ichigo, knowing that he wants to return to the Seireitei as soon as possible to help his friends, as is clearly shown in this page. But what Tenjiro got was a calm and confident response, showing that Ichigo has changed and has a firmer spirit, as noted by the other Zero Squad members. So no, it didn't take Ichigo a week to travel to the Seireitei with Shunpo, nor would it have taken him a week. Many disingenuous Bleach glazers use this statement to establish ridiculous distances, so I wanted to point it out before moving forward. Now, while the manga left it at that, the anime changed it a bit. In season 2 episode 6 of the 1000-year Blood War arc, there is a mid-episode infographic. Paraphrasingly, it says that the distance between the Seireitei and Soul King Palace is so great that it would take a Shinigami a week with their normal Shunpo. It then goes on to say that the speed of Shunpo varies from person to person. This means that, even though Tenjiro just wanted to get a reaction out of Ichigo, what he said did have some truth to it. For a normal Shinigami, they'd take the stairs Senjumaru laid out for Ichigo. The question then becomes, how fast is a regular Shunpo? This question doesn't really have an answer, but keep it in mind as I'll circle back to it. After Tenjiro runs his joke, Ichigo says if he hurries, he can make it back in half a day. Ichibei tells Ichigo that the Quincy began their invasion 3 hours ago, causing Ichigo to frantically rush to the Seireitei, asking Ichibei why he didn't say so earlier. This is noteworthy because in chapter 546, the Quincy began their second invasion of the Seireitei, and we are shown a clock tower which reads almost exactly 5. We know this to be 5 PM since in chapter 558, as Rukia and Renji approach the Seireitei, they acknowledge that night is approaching. This scene is notably cut from the anime, something I'll circle back to later in the video. Then, in chapter 581, when Ichigo lands and destroys the clock tower, it reads either 5:15 or 4:15. Since we established that the first shot of the clock tower is PM, this would necessarily have to be AM. The reason for this is that Ichigo began his descent to the Seireitei 3 hours after the Quincy's invasion, which should be around 8 PM. While it's generally agreed upon that the time reads 5:15 AM, I can't say I fully agree with it as opposed to 4:15 AM. Based on the shot, it's really hard to tell since it appears to be almost equally away from 3 and 6, which would be around 4:30, but the minute hand doesn't suggest that. It is a minor nitpick, but it's something that I just wanted to point out. The real issue here is that it suggests that the Quincy invasion went on for 11 to 12 hours, and it took Ichigo 8 to 9 hours to travel from the Soul King Palace to the Seireitei. This is problematic because, while in the manga we can infer that it's nighttime when Ichigo returns, with the paneling being a bit ambiguous, that isn't the case in the anime. When the second invasion begins and when Ichigo returns, the anime depicts it as what appears to be peak noon. There's no sign of dawn or dusk breaking or twilight, almost as if only a few hours had passed. This creates an issue, because though 5 PM is still daytime, the sun shouldn't be that bright, especially not for 4 or 5 AM, which is when Ichigo should be returning. And we know that there's night in the Soul Society, as is shown many times across the series, such as in chapter 148. Unless you want to argue that the Soul Society is simply much larger than Earth, this is an obvious inconsistency, which is why I believe Kubo avoided adding the clock tower to the anime adaptation of these scenes. Given the countless additions and changes the anime made to this arc, it is generally accepted as the correct representation of the events that transpired and should be held with more validity than the manga. Because of this, I don't believe the time the clock tower gave us should be used. Rather, we should make some presumptions as to what time the aforementioned events occurred. As mentioned, it appears to be around noon when the second invasion begins and when Ichigo arrives. At the earliest, I'd say this is around 7 AM, as it should be sometime after sunrise given the clear blue sky. At the latest, I'd say around 6 PM. It has to be sometime before sunset because, once again, there is a clear blue sky, with none of those yellowish orange pre-dusk or post-dawn colors you see close to sunset or sunrise. This means that the invasion should have gone on for a maximum of 11 hours prior to Ichigo's arrival, which is pretty close to the clock tower time in the manga and almost the exact time if we assume it reads 4:15 AM. This means that Ichigo began traveling to the Seireitei at around 10 AM and didn't arrive until 6 PM, making his total travel time 8 hours. Again, this is just a rough estimate, but it makes sense with what we see and with the statement Ichigo gave about it taking him half a day. But keep this statement in mind, as I'll also circle back to it. So, for a normal Shinigami with Shunpo, it would take them a week to travel this distance going down the stairs. But it only took Ichigo about 8 to 12 hours. Now the next question is, just how fast was Ichigo moving? In the past, people have tried to argue that Ichigo's Shunpo is around the speed of lightning, because he could casually keep up with Candace and blitz her lightning arrows. They say these arrows move at the speed of lightning because of this statement in the Can't Fear Your Own World novel. I never understood this reasoning, as this statement doesn't say that. It blatantly says that Candace's arrows are far slower than an actual lightning strike. The statement about quote-unquote being worthy enough to be called lightning speed isn't literal. It's a figure of speech, an idiom. The terms lightning fast or lightning quick are just ways of saying that something is very fast. It doesn't actually mean it's as fast as lightning. There are other statements in the novel that suggest that Tokinada and Ginjo may be around the speed of lightning, but even these are clouded by ambiguity. Rather than focusing on these, however, I want to use what the anime showed us. One thing I want to talk about was the stance I was going to use to try and debunk this enormous distance. It is the fact that throughout his entire journey, there isn't any evidence that Ichigo actually used Shunpo. From the beginning of his descent to when he crashed into the clock tower, it just looks like he's free falling. One may argue that he's boosting himself somehow, but in the anime, we actually get a shot of him falling. So let's calculate his speed. Using his height as a frame of reference, I determined that he traveled a distance of 150 meters. Assuming the cinematic time of 4 seconds represents the actual time that elapsed, it gives him a speed of 38 meters per second or 137 kilometers per hour. Using our time frame of 8 to 12 hours, it gives us a total distance of 1,100 to 1,650 kilometers. Now, does it make sense that it would take a regular Shinigami with Shunpo a week to travel this distance? The answer is yes. Yes, it does. You see, though Ichigo has incredible stamina, allowing him to perform strenuous tasks for over a week, the same can't be argued for a regular Shinigami. The amount of time they can continuously use Shunpo is very contentious due to the sheer lack of evidence. But let me make some assumptions as to their total travel time per day. The first of these assumptions is that they can use Shunpo consecutively or non-consecutively for a total time of 4 hours per day. The second is that they can do so for 8 hours a day. The third is that they can do it for half a day. And the fourth and final assumption will be that they can do it non-stop. Though the distance Ichigo covered was around 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers, that's only if you travel straight down. A regular Shinigami would likely use the stairs laid out by Senjumaru. Using this shot right here, and Ichigo's height of 174 centimeters as a reference point, a full revolution down these stairs is a distance of about 21 meters. But the distance you travel vertically is about 5 meters. This means that if you go straight down like Ichigo did instead of taking the stairs, your journey is shortened by around 4 times. In turn, this means that the aforementioned week of traveling would actually cover a distance of 4,470 to 7,150 kilometers. Using the travel times I previously assumed, our ordinary Shinigami would be traveling at an average speed of 26 kilometers an hour at the lowest and 255 kilometers an hour at the highest. Since this calculation relies on Ichigo moving at 137 kilometers per hour, any value exceeding 100 kilometers an hour can likely be ignored, and any value lower than 50 kilometers an hour can possibly also be ignored, since that seems way too slow for Shunpo. This means that they should be traveling around 80 kilometers per hour based on this calculation. There are 2 issues with this, however. The first is that the result suggests that the terminal velocity in the Soul Society for Ichigo is notably lower than the real world, where you'll likely reach almost 200 kilometers per hour while free falling. The second is the scene that directly follows Ichigo's descent. If we use the moment he crashes into the Seireitei's barrier to the moment he hits the ground, it gives him a travel time of roughly 7 seconds. Now this is very significant, and it is the main thing that made me initially change my entire stance. Using the shot in chapter 546 and episode 1 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc's 2nd season, we can see that this barrier is essentially hemispherical, meaning the distance from its highest point, which Ichigo entered, to the ground should be equal to the Seireitei's radius. In the past, I made a video where I spoke about how the way the Seireitei is visually depicted and its actual size are inconsistent. But in that video, I concluded that its diameter must be somewhere between 500 and 2,400 kilometers. Those are the lowest and highest ends. However, the most accurate values are in the 1,000 to 2,000 kilometer range. This means that the Seireitei's real radius should be between 500 and 1,200 kilometers. Using our previous time frame, this gives us a speed of 71 to 171 kilometers per second, or Mach 210 to Mach 500. Even if you don't want to say that cinematic time accurately transfers over, the exact value isn't what should be focused on. It's the fact that this distance was traveled so quickly. Even in the manga, it takes Ichigo only a few pages to land after hitting the barrier. This is actual, indisputable evidence that Ichigo was traveling at several hundred times the speed of sound here. It also makes the assertion that he was moving far faster than the speed of lightning through scaling to Candace hold more weight. Based on this, I'll use 3 different ends to establish the total distance between the Seireitei and the royal palace. The low and middle ends will just be the 2 speeds I calculated, that is 71 and 171 kilometers per second. And the other will just be unquantifiably above the speed of lightning, which is 440 kilometers per second. Using these speed values and a total travel time between 8 and 12 hours, we can assert that the total distance between the Seireitei and Soul King Palace is between 2 and 19 million kilometers. That's like going to the moon and back twice on the low end and 24 times on the high end. Accepting these values means that the stairs laid out by Senjumaru stretch between 8 and 82 million kilometers. But these results are heavily contradicted. Taking the aforementioned values as true is problematic. For one, it would mean that, even at the slowest, for a random Shinigami to travel that in a week, they'd have to be moving between Mach 42 and Mach 400. This is an issue because Soul Society R Ichigo, even before becoming stronger throughout the arc, was already far beyond the regular Shinigami. This is shown in chapter 55 when he battles Renji. Then, within the Arrancar arc, he got way stronger than this, where one can establish that he got dozens if not hundreds of times faster. So this lies in contradiction with Gin, who, in chapter 400, says that his Bankai extends at Mach 500, which was supposed to be impressive. Then, later on in chapter 414, Gin says that it doesn't extend that fast, meaning it's slower than Mach 500. This makes it impossible for a regular Shinigami to be moving that fast, since Gin's Bankai is slower than Mach 500, with even page 46 of the Unmasked data book just saying it surpasses the speed of sound. I've seen some people try to argue that Ichigo wasn't having trouble with the speed, but if you actually look at the fight, you can clearly see this isn't the case. I might make a video just about Gin's Bankai because a lot of people, namely Bleach glazers, have trouble accepting that it just negates all light speed scaling or anything close to it before this point in the series. Anyways, even ignoring that, if we look at the way the Seireitei is depicted in the anime, we see that it is below the lowest lying clouds. In real life, low-lying clouds tend to be around 200 meters to 2 kilometers above the surface. If the Seireitei has a height between 500 and 1,200 kilometers but is below these clouds, then it implies that the Soul Society is insanely more massive than Earth. To put it in actual terms, if we say that it has roughly the same gravity as Earth and its composition is also roughly the same, then for low-lying clouds to be hundreds of kilometers above the surface, this planet should, at bare minimum, be more than twice the size of the Sun. Hypothetically, at its realistic maximum, it would be larger than the gap between the Sun and Mercury. Let me put it in other terms. In a single second, light can travel 7 times around the Earth. Using this hypothetical size for the Soul Society, it means that it would take light over 10 minutes to make a single revolution around this planet. Now let me ask you this. Do you honestly believe that Kubo considers the size of the planet of the Soul Society to be larger than that of the Sun? And do you also believe that he thinks that the distance between the Seireitei and the Soul King Palace is several times greater than that of the distance between the Earth and the Moon? Before you answer the second one, let me show you something. This is a 2-scale representation of the distance between the Earth and the Moon. I think people often just forget how massive this distance is and the fact that you can fit about 30 Earths within this enormous gap. In the anime, when we are shown the Soul King's palace, its altitude in the Soul Society's atmosphere appears to be analogous to the height at which the stratosphere begins. It's just above the high altitude clouds at a height where you can see both the darkness of space and the blue light of the thinning atmosphere. Some people believe that the Soul King's palace is in a different realm than the Soul Society, but let me debunk this real quick. This idea arises from chapter 223, where we learn of Aizen's plan to enter the Soul King's palace. Yamamoto says that it's in a different dimension, and you need the Oken to access this dimension. Here, the Oken is represented as an actual key, and though I believe Kubo's original idea was for this to be the case, it appears he later changed his mind. In chapter 519, we learn that this supposed key is actually the bones of the Zero Squad members. Then, in chapter 585, and in an infographic in season 2, episodes 6 and 9 of the 1000-year Blood War arc, we learn that there is a 72-layer barrier between the Soul King's palace and the Seireitei. Senjumaru crafts a garment made from their hair and bones to allow Ichigo to pass through these barriers, but in turn it creates a hole that didn't close for 6,000 seconds, allowing Yuha to reach the Soul King's palace. The infographic also says that Ichigo was descending at high speeds. In chapter 622, Aizen acknowledges the hole in the 72-layer barrier and says he can shoot down the Soul King's palace. In season 3, episode 6 of the 1000-year Blood War arc, Urahara mentions that the Soul King's palace is directly above the Seireitei. Based on this, it's self-evident that Kubo just changed his mind, and the quote-unquote dimension that needed a key to be opened was just the 72-layer barrier. So no, the Soul King's palace is not in a separate dimension. It is just very high up in the sky and surrounded by a barrier that can only be opened by the hair and bones of the Zero Squad members, or a material made out of it. The question as to how high in the air is it is what's perplexing. You can't just say Ichigo was free falling or that it is just in the stratosphere, since he traveled the Seireitei's radius in mere seconds. You also can't say that the distance is astronomical, since though it implies many outlandish things, the most significant would be the speed of a normal Shinigami, which wouldn't make sense with previously established speeds. This includes Candace's lightning scaling if you want to grant it to her. So, what do we do here? How can we arrive at a conclusion that makes sense but is also consistent with everything we see? The answer to this question is that we can't. To me, Kubo is an excellent writer, but it seems he doesn't thoroughly understand certain things. I know I bring it up constantly, but the video I made about the size of the Seireitei in Las Noches is what made me fully accept this. Watch the video if you haven't, since I won't rehash my points here. What I will do is tell you the conclusion I arrived at, which is that Kubo cannot seem to visually grasp the size of the aforementioned structures. Take the scene of Ichigo falling, for example. Using just the visuals, he isn't even traveling at terminal velocity. Yeah, sure, you can argue that cinematic time isn't representative, but it's clear that he isn't traveling that fast or that far in that scene. Despite the Seireitei being hundreds of kilometers across, if you try to determine its size based on just visuals, you won't get anything more than 5 to 15 kilometers in diameter. This structure is somehow below the clouds, which implies that the actual planet it's on is larger than the sun. The same inconsistencies apply to Las Noches. Something that I've never mentioned before but always wanted to talk about was the fact that Candace proudly yells that her Galvanoblast has a whopping 5 gigajoules of energy, which is barely a single ton of TNT. Not a megaton, mind you, a single ton, as in 1,000 kilograms of TNT. In other words, that's barely building level by Versatile Wiki's steering system. It's clear that Kubo just read about the amount of energy lightning has, saw a large number, and slapped it on without fully understanding just how insignificant that value is relative to everything else we've seen in the show. Another example is page 150 of the Mask Databook, which mentions Resurrección Grimjow destroying a 30-meter wide column as if his Gran Rey Zero in base wasn't threatening to destroy Las Noches. I say all of this to show you that Kubo isn't perfect, and no one should expect him to be, especially not with something like this. Because of that, I don't think we should try that hard to find a specific distance, because in reality, I don't think that Kubo knows it or that it even exists. I think he just wanted the Soul King's palace to be extremely high up in the sky. He wanted it above the clouds and everything else as a representation of the Soul King's godly nature and untouchability. I think he considers it within the Soul Society's atmosphere and not like some kind of satellite like the moon. Especially when he puts it not that much higher than the clouds. If I were to put a number on the distance between the Seireitei and the Soul King's palace, I would say it's within the thousands to tens of thousands of kilometers. I don't believe it's as close to the ground as just a few dozen kilometers, since it took Ichigo so long to travel that distance. But I also don't believe it's just a few hundred kilometers. I do think saying this distance is hundreds of thousands to millions of kilometers away from the Seireitei is an overestimation. And, as I said before, it implies that the Soul Society is larger than the sun, which I don't think is something Kubo meant when he said that it would take a week to travel with Shunpo. He clearly sees the Soul Society as essentially the afterlife and a parallel to Earth, having called them two sides of the same coin in page 96 of the Soul's Databook. Before I conclude this video, there are a few things I want to mention. The first is that it's possible it didn't take Ichigo 8 to 12 hours to travel this distance. As I explained before, using just the manga, it is undeniable that it took him around 8 to 9 hours to travel. But since the anime is accepted as a better representation of the 1000-year Blood War arc, the time frame is actually dubious. Ichigo does say it'll take him half a day, but this doesn't have to be true. It could just be a way to show us that Ichigo has changed and is confident in himself. In essence, he's basically saying, if you tell me it'll take a week, I'll do it in half a day. It isn't Kubo speaking to us directly about the time frame, it's just him showing us Ichigo's resolve and confidence. This is further exemplified by when he calls Urahara and basically says, just hold on, I got this. I don't really try to read or interpret the underlying themes of a story when making these kind of videos, but I do feel that this is the intent here. And trying to read this as just the author saying it took Ichigo half a day is pretty superficial. Especially when Ichigo shouldn't really know the distance. This is why I pointed out how it appears to be peak noon both when the Quincy invasion begins and when Ichigo arrives at the Seireitei. It doesn't look like a significant amount of time passed, especially when the invasion had already gone on for 3 hours. Not that much happens between Ichigo's descent from the Soul King's palace and his arrival at the Seireitei. It doesn't make sense that 8 to 12 hours had passed with what we see. Granted, nothing much really happened in those 3 hours Ichigo said passed, but my point remains. The last thing I wanted to mention was versus Wiki and their currently accepted distance. They used this shot of the Soul King's palace and said that the thing in the sky is the sun. Using this, they assert that the Soul King's palace is around 143 million kilometers away from the Seireitei, or about 4 million kilometers away from the sun. I have many issues with this calc. Given I've established that the Soul King's palace is within the Seireitei's atmosphere, it implies that this atmosphere is just 4 million kilometers away from the sun. So, you'd have a planet that is larger than the sun, and the sun itself is just 4 million kilometers away from it. At this distance, these two celestial bodies are about 15 times closer to each other than Mercury is to the sun. So, the intense heat should evaporate all water in the Soul Society, erasing all of the clouds we see right below the Soul King's palace. This heat should have been noted by Ichigo when he first got there, but it isn't. I won't do any calculations since it isn't necessary, but on Mercury, which should be 15 times further away, the days get as hot as 430 degrees Celsius. I also question whether that's actually the sun, as in the shots they use, its position changes dramatically. It can go from being above them to them standing at the same height as it. In addition, its size also changes dramatically. From what should not be that far away, it looks like it's about the same size as the Soul King Greater, which is the cylindrical structure in the middle. But when you look at it from right next to the Soul King Greater, it looks extremely close. The distance between these shots shouldn't be that significant, as these structures are not that massive. But for some reason, the sun's size changes dramatically. I'll just say it. I don't think that this is the sun. It just looks like some kind of intense light source behind the Soul King Greater, or something akin to it. I say this because in every shot, it just looks like it's sitting behind the Soul King Greater and not 4 million kilometers away. At 4 million kilometers away, the size and position of the sun shouldn't be changing this significantly, especially when the gap between these other shots and the Soul King's palace are comparatively insignificant. In Season 3, Episode 1, Yuha just walks to the Soul King Greater from the Soul King's palace front approach. We are given a shot that shows that it is not that far away from where he fought Ichibe, but the size of this supposed sun changes dramatically. So yeah, based on what we see, it doesn't make sense to assume that this is the sun, which is what this calc uses as its basis. As I said before, I think trying to establish a precise distance between the Seireitei and Soul King's palace is a fruitless task. But I do believe that saying it is several thousands to tens of thousands of kilometers away from the Seireitei is the correct position to hold, and the value should be within that range. And yeah, that's about it for now. I promise you that my next video won't be even as half as long as this one. And I won't take like a 6 months hiatus before I post it either. I'll try to keep all future videos below the 15-minute mark so I can pump them out faster. As I said, I tried to do it for this one, but sometimes you just got too much to yap about, dog, and it ends up becoming this long. But yeah, I'm done for now. See ya.